pretty quickly people become distressed and then they enter a fight or flight response. And that's really what we look for, markers of a fight or flight response. You're looking at turnover, is turnover going up? And you're looking at markers of engagement.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process. Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers, and in each of these episodes, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with process practitioners from all types of organization, all sizes of organization, all areas of organization, and those that are working internally with organizations, those that are working externally. And if you're just joining us for the first time, we are up to episode 160 plus. I can't give you the exact number, but over 160 episodes at this point over the last couple of years, and some very insightful conversations. We've had a few people back on for a second time and a third time, but all around the topic of business process management. It's a very diverse space. It's a very broad space. And so in each of these conversations, we like to pick a topic and do a deep dive into that particular topic. And in today's conversation, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Joseph Drasin. Now, Joseph is the Assistant Vice President at the University of Maryland, has quite an extensive background in the process space. But in today's conversation, it's all about change management. And I think that you're going to find this episode very insightful. Joseph, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I really am looking forward to the conversation.
So we might start off with, because obviously it's the Process Pioneers podcast. We have a community of process practitioners. Talk to me about why is change management so important when it comes to business process management? What's the relationship then? How do they complement one another?
Certainly, and I can start a little bit with my own story. I spent quite a number of years as a process improvement professional. I can still consider myself, that's my real role in what I do. I mean, at the end of the day, we improve processes which require change, and that's really where change management came into me. Now, my academic background was in change management even before kind of I got into the process world. But I realized that it was just a really nice marriage because, just from a practical standpoint, once you have your idea for your new process and you've designed it, well, you're going to have to implement it. So you better be really good at implementing it. So change management's necessary for effective implementations. But even more so, I think there's a really nice connection between the skills and approach that process professionals use and the skills and approach that change management professionals use. And I have teams of both who work in my group, and they work really well together, I think, because similar mindset, similar approach, similar way of thinking about people. The best process people I've known are great change management people, and they understand when they're changing a process, they're not just, moving lines and boxes around, they're moving people's lives around and changing those people's day-to-day experience, and they understand the importance of engaging with those individuals who are going to be affected by those changes. And so I think, for me, it was a very natural progression in my career. And again, I don't think I've left the process world. I'm in both worlds now. And really, I think it's critical that all process professionals become great agents of change.
That's really interesting. And I love how you put that when you're moving those boxes and circles, you're not just changing a drawing or a picture, you're impacting someone's world, you're impacting someone's life, you're impacting someone's how excited they are to come to work every morning, because I guess you're either making it easier for them, you're making it more enjoyable for them, or you're making things more complicated for them, depending on what the outcome of that process is.
Absolutely. And as we talk about, I know we're going to go into a couple different areas of change management, but even when we're making things better for an individual, and hopefully we always are, we are still impacting them with the change. And people, can be a challenge, and when we talk about adaptive systems that people have to go through change, it takes energy for people to go through change, even a positive change. And we always have to be really cognizant of it. I always tell this story from this from a while ago on a project, and there was it was an accounting process we were automating, and there was some clerk whose job was literally to take a piece of paper and move it from one place to another and type in some information. And we were auditing that. We were very proud of ourselves because it was actually going to lead to a pretty nice efficiency improvement. But what we didn't think about was, that person processed that was their identity. They actually got to meet certain people every day because they had to deal with the paperwork. And even though obviously it was a good change, I'm glad we didn't fully appreciate that the effect we were having on that individual's day-to-day life. And so those stories like that always kind of resonate with me when I always talk about lines and boxes are people and relationships.
That's great. That's great. And being in the change management space for some time now, talk to us about how change management has changed over time, and I guess in particular over the past 3-4 years.
So change management is actually still a relatively new field when you compare it to process improvement or like software engineering. It's still relatively young in its field, but it really has gone through a massive change in the last 3 or 4 years, really, which seems to have been triggered by COVID. So when we change management, I'll say in the pre-COVID world, was really focused on one thing, which was called desire. I call it desire. So the focus of change management professionals was to create desire for change in an individual, because the kind of general thesis, the key theorem of change management was people who have desire for the change, staff who desire the change will then engage with the change. And we know when people engage, the more they engage with the change, the more effective that change is, the more likely our project is to be successful. So that was almost all change management interventions were really focused at creating desire, educating the people on the value of the change, showing the people how the change, would be possible, and showing people, how the change would fit into their life and how it would be good for them. So it's always about, this is a good thing. It's good for you. This makes sense. People engage. So that was always kind of the accepted belief. And I still, to today, of course, we need that. But what really happened, and this is still a very new area, so there's, I won't be able to answer every question about it, but there's this new challenge we have, which has been labeled change fatigue. The term is relatively new, but the concept actually is not brand new. But it's this collective idea that people are worn out psychologically from the amount of change. And there's a couple things that makes it different. And again, I talk about this term somewhat generally. There's still disagreement on exactly what it is, which is normal in this field. In the past, though, there's always been this perception that organizations need to be careful about how much change they go through at any one time. Organizations only have so much capacity for change. Individuals have only so much capacity for change as well. And as leaders, we got to keep in mind how much we're putting our staff through. But what seems to have happened in COVID, the data shows that COVID really seems to have been the point of shift, is that in today, that desire is not sufficient enough, that people seem to have been worn down by the amount of changes and the effect of COVID, that they're not able to engage in change as effectively as before. And particularly, this fatigue is not let's just slow down for a couple months, give people a chance to cool off and re-engage. It seems to be a much longer term impact. And I like that the term fatigue, because even though it's a psychological experience, it really reminds me and makes me think about someone who's worn out after a really hard workout or going swimming for a long. They're just exhausted, and so they're limited in what they can do. And this is what we're seeing with organizations right now, and with employees in organizations. Just recently, there was a paper that came out that tried to quantify this, and I call them our adaptive systems. So people, and I touched on this, I know, when we talked some time ago, people really are designed for consistency in our lives. We need that. We rely on our world to stay pretty much consistent because we just don't have the mental energy to constantly deal with too many variables in our lives. Now we do have some ability. Obviously, we change in life. We go through changes at work, at home, and so we do have these adaptive systems that allow us to adjust. We just can't take too much of it at any time. So I was reading a study that essentially said what they used a different term, but I will say, our adaptive systems are about half as strong as they were before COVID. And there's still a lot of debate exactly what caused that, but whatever it is, COVID really seems to be this turning point, and we have not recovered from it. Most of this data is from the US, but what data I've seen outside the US pretty much tells the same story, is that we are seeing not only people's ability to engage with change seems to be reduced, but how they're acting out at changes is in a, becoming disengaged quicker, becoming belligerent or combative, and things like that seems to be on the rise. So again, I mostly focus on the U.S., but I don't think this is a U.S. phenomena in any way. And when I talk to colleagues outside the U.S., they tell the same stories. So anecdotally, it seems to be a worldwide phenomena.
So you mentioned one of the symptoms there of people becoming more combative. Can you kind of break down for us what are the common signs and symptoms that are indicating employees may be experiencing change fatigue? I'm sure there's a number of them that we can be aware of.
Right. So I'll start with kind of the other side of it, which is what causes people to act that way. So again, I'll go back to our ability to adapt. We have some level of it. When that becomes overwhelmed, shall I say, we become stressed, and we've all experienced that before. And again, people deal with stress and anxiety at different levels, but pretty quickly people become distressed, and then they enter a fight or flight response. And that's really what we look for, markers of a fight or flight response. Which is usually on the flight side. We look, you're looking at turnover. Is turnover going up? And you're looking at markers of engagement. Are people engaging in their work? If people are becoming disengaged, that is often a sign that they're in this fight or flight, which means probably right now I would assume that is due to a fatigue state. On the combativeness side, you're looking for things like cynicism at projects. People, taking a very negative view, people being caustic in how they speak, in a, manner that is not normal in whatever industry you're in. We're looking for a lot of those kind of things. And even, I've observed in a number of cases, people speaking out in a way that 5 years ago, I would never have expected, people to talk this way. And honestly, some of it is just, if you're someone who's, dealing with change in your organization or leading it, try and look at actions you're seeing in your organization with that lens of kind of fight or flight. Are people worn out? Are people fatigued? And you'll start to really see a constellation of data that kind of speaks to that in most organizations. Obviously, it's not universal by any means, but I think it's not just looking for these markers. It's having that framework of observing that I think is really, really helpful for leaders to, it gives you another tool to reinterpret what you're seeing.
Yeah. So it sounds like it would be more qualitative than quantitative, although
there is some quantitative approaches. Again, we can look at turnover, and there's different quantitative tools for engagement levels, which I think is really important because it's easy to see what you want to see with qualitative approaches. But some of it is, qualitative, like things like cynicism are actually really hard to measure. But we know it when we see it.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the day, also there's productivity measures, and that's why we want people, in addition, we'd like people to be healthy and have good mental health, but that's another thing to look at is, just productivity around certain areas. Are you taking a hit there? When you're looking at people also distressed and disengaged, people look at things like sick days and things like that. And again, it's not because you're trying to catch people on using too many sick days. It's like literally, are people becoming more sick?
Yes, right. And I suppose that this whole concept of change fatigue, it'd be, the pressure would be on because it's not just in your work environment, but I would suppose that or propose that there'd be a lot of change fatigue happening external to work as well. So, is there, when you're talking about people change wearing people out, people are designed for consistency. If we don't have any consistency in any area of our life, if every area of our life is turbulent, then that's only going to compound the problem, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. And great that you brought that up, because traditionally change fatigue has looked almost strictly at the workplace as the primary driver of change. And obviously that, where we spend probably half our waking hours, it is a big part of our lives. But, what I was speaking just earlier, COVID obviously had nothing to do with work. And that seems to be the catalyst event that has really shifted individuals' ability to engage with change. And obviously that was an external event. But it's not just that. Again, from a U.S. perspective, a few years ago during COVID, we went through a very tumultuous political experience. In about a year, we're going through another election, which is going to drive up anxiety and so forth. There's been social changes. There's obviously huge economic changes in the U.S. We have, there's a big push towards unionization because the disparity of incomes is really driving. So whether it's political, economic, social, your work, it's like change is happening everywhere. And I think, to add to that, we're more exposed to those changes than ever.
Sure.
And we just, through social media and other information devices, it's like we're constantly being triggered and our systems are constantly trying to engage and be ready for change. And it wears our bodies down. We're not designed to work that way.
So how do organizations effectively manage this whole topic of change fatigue? Because I'm sure that as you're speaking, we've got a wide community here, and I'm sure a number of them are nodding their head, being like, "Hey, this is what we're going through, and this is what I've noticed." And maybe they haven't labeled it, or they haven't recognized it as necessarily as a thing that can be improved or worked on, but how obviously that's what you've been doing with some clients, and that's what you're observing in your world. So how do organizations effectively manage this?
That is the big question right now, and I will freely state from the beginning, no one has the answer yet. Again, this is a relatively new phenomena, or at least it's been recognized, and so that is, for myself, and many others, what the next many years of our lives is going to be about, is trying to figure that out. Going back to what I said at the beginning, a lot of traditional change management interventions, and I would say process improvement methodologies, are still important. In fact, I would say organizations need to invest even more in them because of a lot of them do align with helping with this challenge of change fatigue. All the things we talk about, engaging, like if you're going through a process improvement, engaging with all the stakeholders and talking to people and getting those interviews and feedback, those still do help with people feeling some sense of control and input and fairness, which are really, really important. I would say the challenge is now you can do everything right and still have a really rocky road ahead of you because of, depending on the environment. I do think it's really important for change leaders to kind of have their finger on the pulse of their organization and understand readiness for change even more. Again, we can't, put a pause on the world usually. Most of our organizations are in a place that we don't have the luxury of not changing, whether it's, we deal with the regulation and compliance all the time, but also just the competitive world is constantly changing. And then you as an organization don't have a lot of options most of the time. So all the good change management practices, whether it's training or communication or engagement or solicitation, all these different approaches, I think just are become more and more important. And I think trying to approach change without that or without good process improvement practices is just going to be even more of a disaster than it was in the past. The failures are going to be stronger. So right now, again, the puzzle's not complete. I think we have some good interventions that we've had in the past that are still applicable, still really important. But what we need to do is, figure out what the rest of those pieces are and how to fill it in. I always look to quality leaders as the most important part of change, and everything seems to reinforce that. Leaders who understand people, understand how to motivate and really show humility and compassion towards their organizations are really critical, because people are in a very challenging environment right now and really need leaders who can help them through this experience.
So for those leaders that are listening to this and, they're hearing what you're saying, they're like, okay, I need to adopt this. I need to implement this. I need to be more aware of this. What's the next thing they should be doing? What's kind of step one on this journey? Not that change management is new for any organization, but obviously giving this whole idea of change fatigue more attention, more airtime, so to speak.
I think this becomes the first step. This becomes a main discussion of the leadership team, ensuring that this is understood and the challenge, and being collective about the changes going on in the organization. Just from a practical standpoint, I'll step away from this as good for people's health, and it's good to be good to your caring towards your employees. But organizations who are picking up on that, they're in a fatigued environment and keep trying to push too many changes, they're going to have really negative results. So I think leaders need to really take a hard look at the changes they're going through. And I know that's tough to do. And I go through this in my own organization. I do it with other organizations. Prioritizing change is really hard, and pushing things off is really challenging, but that's the first step. And being open with your organization in terms of recognizing this challenge. There's some really good, there are some organizations out there trying to use like mental health data to look at how to engage with this challenge and change readiness. And there's some instruments that try and assess that in organizations. And I think that's really important for people to do. Gallup they have their engagement survey, which is a pretty good one. Certainly not perfect, but it's pretty solid. And over the last several years, I haven't seen, I think this year's and maybe last year's report, but certainly for several years, the trend was a reduction in engagement with change. And any organization that is seeing that trend should be really looking deep into that number and what they can do to and what's causing that, because these numbers are not naturally going to get better. And again, the space outside work is not in most of our environments is not lending us any help, shall I say.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, change, the rate of change, it's only going to increase. It's only going to speed up. And I think it's only going to be more of a challenge if it's not handled and managed well for people in organizations. Would you say then, I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking that leveraging technology could be a solution of obviously many solutions to this whole idea of change fatigue, because obviously if we can put the leverage technology to be able to participate in that change or take on the weight or the burden of that change. I'm sure there's a better way of saying it, but and freeing up our people to do things that are, I guess, it isn't going to wear them out so quickly.
I think there is, and I know in the space of AI, there's a lot of opportunities that we're already seeing with ways to um, optimize the experience for employees. I take it back, some time ago in the medical field, you needed a physician to do everything because it's highly skilled, highly technical work, obviously. But as the technology became better, and again, I'm speaking from the US environment, which I know we have a very different healthcare structure than everyone else. But as technology has become better, a lot of decision making was actually able to be pushed down because, you have a computer that will tell you if those drugs you just tried to use together are going to cause a problem. You have health, EMRs that keep track of a lot of things and can warn you and make suggestions. So again, it's not replacing people. We still have tons of physician assistants, nurses, doctors. We need more of them. But the idea is to try and take some of the decision making and at least provide, it's rather than AI doing the work, it's assisting us with the work. I think there's some opportunities there. The challenge, I think, is going to get much, not in a process or change management. We start getting into kind of social and political. What does society do when we have another revolution of technology doing more of our work? We had the industrial revolution when machines started taking over. We had a technology revolution where robotics took, and each of those times was a very challenging social shift. I suspect we will go through at least another of those pretty soon. And I would say none of those in the short term reduced some of the challenges of, change. I think we can all agree a lot of good things came out of it. But I think organizations, when they're pursuing these technologies, need to be really cognizant of why they're doing it and how it's going to affect their environment, not just as a labor savings approach.
Yeah, very true. Very true. And speaking of the future and the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years, how do you see change management evolving? Well, I guess what sort of trends are you noticing now, and what are you anticipating in the long term? How will organizations have to adapt or evolve from a change management perspective?
So I think in the I'll say short term, next several years, it's really going to be this how do we lead organizations in a fatigued environment? Again, as I mentioned, that's kind of my focus. Developing strategies that can help individuals and organizations that are going through change be successful. So I think that really is going to be the next many, many years, because I think the data shows that this fatigue state is around for at least 3 to 5 years. I think after the other, and it's probably going to start at the same time, is touching on what you said earlier, is this next generation of technology. How does that get integrated into organizations in a healthy manner? And that it's going to be a really complicated, because I said it's really much more political and social challenge. What are the laws and regulations that are going to come out about this? We've already had several passed in the US, and I know Europe has some. But that's going to cause just a huge change to the landscape of organizations, potentially as much as like the industrial or technology revolution did. And so bringing our organizations through that experience is going to be, over the next decade, there's going to be a big piece of that, and how we choose to use these technologies in our organizations. And it's going to raise a lot of questions that are, we're all going to have to figure out the answer to.
Yes, it's certainly will be an interesting environment to navigate in the future ahead. But and I'm excited to keep now that you've kind of opened this world of change fatigue for me, because I think as I was saying before we dived in, it wasn't a term or a phrase I'd heard before, but it certainly makes a whole lot of sense. And now that we've kind of fleshed it out, I can see it happening. I'm just thinking of the many conversations I've had, the different organizations I'm connected with or involved in, and it being a real issue. It does make a lot of sense. So I'm interested to see how this develops and evolves over the coming years. But Joseph, I just want to thank you so much for sitting down and catching up with me today. A very interesting conversation, one that we haven't had on the podcast series before. I'm sure the process community has gleaned a lot of value from this conversation. So thanks again for catching up. It's been an absolute privilege.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. And I just go back to what I said at the very beginning. Process work is change work, and change work is process work. And I think there's a really important bridging of these two communities, because they really are doing the same kind of, they have the same objectives and a lot of the same ways of thinking. And I'm really glad to be able to have this conversation, and hopefully we can continue keep the conversation going into the future.